Hello and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. First, a couple of programming notes. After today's episode, we'll be taking the rest of July off. Our next episode will be on August 5th and will feature Christian Galleri. Christian is the creator of one of the most successful complementary currency systems in the world, the Chiemgauer, a regional currency in Bavaria, Germany, which incorporates Silvio Gesell's Demurrage proposal. Christian created the Chiemgauer in 2003 as a project for his students while working as a teacher in a Waldorf school. Today, more than 20 years later, the currency continues to operate and now has an annual turnover of over 7 million euros. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone of a few different ways you can support this show. First, share our content. If you enjoy a particular episode of Economy 2.0, post it on Facebook or Twitter, or email it to people you think might be interested. Second, if you know of people who might be good guests for future episodes, get in touch with me directly and let me know about them. And lastly, if you're able, consider making a financial contribution to the show. As I mentioned previously, we hope to switch from twice a month to weekly episodes later this year. But in order to do so, we need some additional resources. Please visit the donation page at silviogesell.com to help us out. All right, at the beginning of every episode, I always say Economy 2.0 is meant to be a conversation. As I've explained before, this series grew out of a course I taught at the Henry George School last year. In that course, I spoke about my idea for designing a model for creating alternative economic zones based on the proposals of Silvio Gesell. One of the reasons for developing this idea is my concern that the conventional economy could fail in the not too distant future. If that happens, it will put the lives of everyone who depends on existing systems of global production and exchange, which is to say almost everyone on Earth, at risk. So this is not just an intellectual exercise. It is potentially a subject that could be a matter of life and death for billions of people. As I spoke about this idea, I started hearing from people who were thinking along similar lines. Like me, these people are concerned about the potential failure of the economy and are trying to design their own alternative systems to supplement or replace it. The more this happened, the more I perceived a need to bring such people together and facilitate conversations between them. That was the inspiration for the creation of this series, to facilitate conversations not just between our guests and the audience, as we do in our normal episodes, but also between the different guests. And that's what we're doing today for the first time. We're bringing back 3 guests from past episodes and one new one to have a group discussion about a specific topic that each one of them has been thinking about individually so that they can meet, discuss, debate, and who knows, perhaps even collaborate. Roundtable episodes like this will become a regular feature of Economy 2.0 going forward. As always, I want to mention that anyone in the live Zoom audience is welcome to join the conversation at any time. To do so, just use the raise hand button under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. And as a reminder, these episodes are recorded and will be published on the YouTube channels of both the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. All right, let me bring in today's guests. Mike, George, Will, and Teun. All right, joining us today are 3 past guests: Will Ruddick, founder of Grassroots Economics; Teun van Sambeek, creator of the OneCoin H and Copiania systems, George Lovegrove, founder of the Web3 Association, and joining us for the first time is Michael Meehan, a web developer and entrepreneur who works with me on matters relating to the Silvio Gesell Foundation. When I took my first economics class in college, the professor defined the subject of economics as the study of the allocation of scarce resources. I didn't question the definition at the time. It wouldn't be until decades later that I started to think critically about the definition, considering other possible definitions, and thinking about the consequences of accepting that particular framing of the subject of economics. The word economics comes from the Greek word oikonomia, which was used by Aristotle and means household management. Household management is quite a different framing from the study of the allocation of scarce resources. What do those two definitions have in common, and how are they different? In a household, complex dynamics of giving, receiving, and cooperating take place, usually without any formal agreements. It would be bizarre, for example, for a father and a son to formally agree that the son will take out the garbage in exchange for the father giving him a ride to school. When pre-existing personal relationships exist based on trust, as they do in a family or small community, there's no need for formal agreements. The son doesn't need a specific assurance that he'll be getting a ride to school in order to render the service of taking out the garbage. In fact, oftentimes in the context of a family, there may not be exchange at all in the sense of goods and services flowing from A to B and other goods and services of equal value going from B to A. All members know they'll benefit through participation in the group, regardless of whether they received direct compensation for any particular good or service that they provide. In a network of trust-based relationships, formal exchange is often not necessary or even desirable. But when personal relationships do not exist, how can people coordinate their activities such that they can feel confident of being treated fairly? Who, for example, in a business context, would ever agree to provide goods or services without a specific agreement ensuring that he or she will be compensated? So the dynamics which govern the coordination of our activities in the context of a family or small community are of a different nature from those which do so among society generally. When personal relationships and trust can't be the basis of economic coordination, something else needs to take their place. And this is where the need for money, laws, contracts, etc. arise. All of these institutions are substitutes for trust. This means that the economics of household management is qualitatively different from the economics that determines the allocation of scarce resources in society. And this also means that there's a disconnect between how we behave within small trust-based groups and how we behave outside of them. But what if recently developed digital technologies might make it possible for the first time in human history for trust-based dynamics to extend beyond groups of people in which everyone knows each other? What if, for example, I can establish via a digital network that someone who I trust trusts someone else who I don't know? Could I then trust that other person and coordinate economically with that person on the basis of trust, even though I don't know them personally? What if technology enables us to develop a web of connections such that trust can extend beyond groups of people who all know each other? What if the digital age has made it possible for the dynamics of household management to become the basis of economic coordination generally? What if the household becomes the entire world? So I'd like to ask Mike to share some more specific ideas in order to orient today's conversation. The idea for this episode came up a couple months ago when Mike and I were talking after he watched the episodes with our other guests. And I'd like for him to try to recap what we talked about that day so as to set the stage for today's conversation. Mike?
Well, thank you very much, Josh. So I will try not to go over information that I assume all of you are most probably deeply familiar with, as Josh just did a great job of kind of touching on all of that. But I'll kind of begin by just saying that as somebody who doesn't have a deep background in economics, my interest is in being supportive and promoting these ideas and participating in learning. And one of the things that I found interesting as I've engaged the Gesell Foundation and the Economy 2.0 conversations is that everybody, each in their own way, is coming to a place where they're seeing the value of Demurrage through their implementation or experimentation. And so as somebody, first off, who hasn't built anything in this subject, I just respected all the work and all the years of dedication everyone's put in here. But for me, I thought maybe I could participate on the adoption side of this project. One of the other reoccurring themes that I see often is that when you talk about such an incredibly complex idea, most people tend to think that the way you can adopt it is either through some sort of large scale reset or collapse, or maybe in a place which is overlooked by the current system that just doesn't favor a particular region. So it gives it time to grow without resistance. And I thought that this might be somewhere I could offer some value. And my studies in university were political science and history, and I studied the topic of power was a big part of it. And so I've always understood, that people have deeply held paradigms, and we've got to figure out how to encourage people and sometimes gently introduce them to an idea so that the truth for them becomes self-evident through either experience or some sort of intuitive kind of process that's disarming and sometimes even playful. So way back when, I told Josh I was going to try to build some sort of very basic game to share how this basic type of economics works and the importance of something like Demurrage. So the primary goal of the game was basically to give people an opportunity through play to learn, one, about Demurrage, and then also about, I think, a really important aspect of economics, which is the division of labor. And that is the idea that cooperation and circulation lead to prosperity, and hoarding leads to decay, and try to do that through some simple game. So of course, the first thing I considered was modifying Monopoly, but it quickly felt wrong because the game's very rooted in type of extractive logic and based on chance, and there's a lot of rigid rules. And if I swapped out some newfangled currency, the iconography, I couldn't really get myself to a baseline. So I decided to strip down everything and start with nothing. And I said, what would be the core components of an economy I'd want to model? And to save myself time, I just grabbed some spreadsheets and AI, and I decided I would model to see if I could get the outcomes for a very primitive game and then build the game around those outcomes so that I didn't have to worry about all the extras involved. I'm just basically looking to introduce something really simple. So if you can imagine a game where you start with like 10 tokens per person, and there's 4 people in a game, and their objective is to survive as long as possible. And they have to consume food and shelter every round. If you go it alone with no division of labor, no cooperation, you're going to get 5 rounds deep. If you introduce a cooperation rule, 2 players can divide their labor and their surplus, and that allows them to extend the number of rounds by cooperating. And obviously that shows that you can be more resilient, and obviously these models worked. And then the third part was to introduce hoarding. So while I haven't mentioned it, the underlying goal would be in any game to understand, as the person running the game, the maximum amount of circulation score one could achieve. And then basically help those players, not by telling them, but by playing that in order to achieve that highest score, the most amount of cooperation and circulation achieves that goal. But if somebody starts to hoard their surplus, the score doesn't get as high. And all three of these things modeled out in this very simple way. So I thought, okay, I'm getting somewhere here. And then I decided to say, wait a second here, we're eating and sleeping. I have to account for energy units. This is too easy. So I basically just recognized that person can use their energy to cooperate with another person. The other person takes advantage of that energy, and then that giver is remembered for giving that energy with some sort of token. And once I got there, I just kind of reran the models without creating money. I said, why introduce artificial money at all? What if all the value built in the game came from the moment of cooperation between two players, or between players, I suppose? And then I thought I would just mint a token whenever that happened. And then I noticed a pattern that outside the game, every version of currency I've ever looked at and have had the opportunity to look at since I've gotten involved, fiat, crypto, gold, UBI, let system, even shells, they're all exogenously imposed, and that's for obvious reasons. But it really made me stop because I tripped onto something, and again, this may not be new to you, but I stopped building the game because I realized I was discovering that something older thing that Josh alluded to, which is something that maybe exists before physical money itself, which is just that we, in a small enough space where memory and trust and context are alive, money is not really needed, and it's the way we understand it today. And I also realized too that even Gesell, for all his insight, is still sees money as a exogenous tool that you apply something to control. He didn't question why do we have money. He just said that money is, and I'm sure there's more to this, of course, but money is something you have to manage. So there's some arbitrary demurrage to that money, for example. But this reminded me of a parable, and I'm only going to bring this up because it kind of is important. So imagine a family of 4 generations. Youngest mom serving dinner, it's Easter dinner, Norman Rockwell type thing. And she sets the Easter ham down in the middle of the table. And one of the young kids sees the ham and notices that the ends of the ham have been trimmed off and says, Mom, why are you cutting the ham? That's like my favorite part, are the little ends. And the mom says, I'll be honest, I don't know why. My mom always did it. So everyone looks at her mother and they ask her. And she goes, I don't know why I did it. I did it because my mom did it. So everyone then looks at the end of the table to the matriarch, and she kind of smiles and says, I never had a big enough pan to fit the whole ham, so I had to cut the ends off. And I thought maybe we're cutting off the ends of our money or economy, and have been since the first form of physical money, not because we want to, but just because there was no better way to do it. And we've just been repeating that inherited structure over and over and over again through exogenous tools, and whether it be, seashells or salts or grains or whatever. And then I just thought to myself, could it be that money's real value is just created in that moment of cooperation instead of relying on an external authority to assign it worth? And it's really just a byproduct of that maybe peer-to-peer moment. So this is just, that idea. There's a couple thoughts to this, but this is just a glimpse of like a technical layer that could exist. So imagine like a simple peer-to-peer array of data where the cooperative act is simply remembered. And I'll use an example with Josh. Years ago when Josh started the foundation, he just wanted a quick website to get up and running. And I said I would be happy to help him. And he was very insistent on paying me because I think he really wanted a particular outcome. But I assured him that this was volunteering, but I would commit to a certain period of time and so on and so forth. And he finally agreed. I wrote it off. I'm just helping somebody do something that I think has a lot of value. But a couple years later, I'm trying to buy a hotel, and all my friends and people I've consulted with are way too excited about it. And I realize I can go to Josh and get a nice, solid analysis of the valuation of the business to help me make sure I'm not going to make a crazy offer. And when I asked Josh for his help, which I would have paid for, he said, you assisted me when I did this. I'm happy to lend time to you. Now, this wasn't barter. He just remembered that I helped him. I had no expectation. And then he assisted me, and they weren't, on par with each other. We just assisted each other. So it's kind of like if you had this, imagine a simple method of tokenizing this in a shared log. So I help Josh with his product. He pulls out his phone, I pull out mine. And we just open up, say, the most primitive app that just runs, say, in the browser, even without internet. And we type in the context. Michael helped with project July 1st, right? We then tap sign, we put in our private keys, you have a digital signature, and that locks in that transaction for the both of us. And now imagine you also had a hash that you could link your prior peer-to-peer transactions in your own log. So you just have this unbreakable, or well, technically it's breakable at this point, but a chain of your work. And I'm just saying this on a peer-to-peer level, no server. Maybe that's something that could be looked into. But the goal was to tokenize the value of that memory. Say this happened, we both agreed, and now it's remembered. And if somebody wants to build something maybe in the future on top of that, like I think of Web3, and again, this is just an idea, I could see that happening if you could define this concept a bit and it made sense to people. But while it seemed doable, it's what about scaling? Can you scale this type of trust or a log like this? And I think Will Ruddick's book and his work shows that this kind of trust can scale, at least locally, in close-knit communities where relationships are contextual, grounded in shared experiences. And we already know that builds these little fibers, and those fibers become threads, and those threads become a fabric, and that fabric is meaningful and resilient at that level. And so I could imagine like a local currency idea related around this. But then I asked myself, what if we wanted to go a little further? And in Economy 2.0 conversations before, another reoccurring challenge that I hear a lot about is the issue of exchange, especially whether it be local systems like a Let's or a community currency, or even the less local or more less trusted systems. Ultimately, you need some sort of exogenous decision as to what currency's value versus another currency's value. And it made me kind of step back again and say, gosh, all right, there's constantly this need to set a rule. So I wondered, can we build an economy that doesn't require an exogenous, a type of money that doesn't require an exogenous exchange valuation at all? Because the value essentially lives in that little memory of trust, and that's carried forward with each cooperative act. So let's say you could extend those fibers outside of your known community and imagine it more like forming and little fibers or strands connecting to completely separate places or groups. So I have a bit of a story here, which is, imagine you have a valley town and a hill town, and you have an egg seller in the valley town, and they want to grow their egg business. So they reach out to their local shed builder, and the shed builder says, I'm too busy to work this season for you. So the person climbs up in the mountain, finds a shed builder who's not as busy. And he finds out that in their community, they charge 2,000 units of trust. I'm just using that as some arbitrary statement for a shed. And the egg seller says, that's like twice the price of what I normally pay, but I really want a shed. So they come to an agreement at 1,500 units. And the builder comes down, builds it. The egg seller starts growing his business. And as they're leaving and parting ways, the shed builder says he wants to buy some eggs. So he picks up a couple dozen and finds out that they're vastly cheaper in the valley. And so the egg seller gets the idea to cart some eggs up into the mountain. And while there are no large scale rules, he decides he'll bring those eggs up, sell them at a higher price. But this is where we're talking just little fibers, but lots of things are happening there. There's a scarcity of eggs in the valley now, so prices will naturally rise. There's a surplus of eggs in the hill town now. The shed builders in the valley realize they can go up in the mountain and make a little bit of a premium and the valley of the mountain town realizes when they're not busy, they can go down and still make sheds at a reasonable price. And over time, those strands, those fibers become strands and then threads, and then maybe even weave those two fabrics together, or maybe just a little. And this is where Josh and I left off. And we touched on one more issue, which is the egg and shed example assumes that communities are in good faith discovering prices and that their economies are really structured based on resources, scarcity, environment. But we're not really assigning a hard value to the token. We're just treating it as this vague unit of trust. But what happens is if another person, for example, comes in and just decides to inflate the value of one of these units. And so I start realizing I'm clearly struggling with the idea of a token of trust, because you have to figure out how to set that. And again, there's this exogenous impulse of people then coming in and manipulating it. And it reminded me of something I learned about years ago, which has to do with, and I might be pronouncing this wrong, the shells that were used in trade in Africa, like Kenya before colonial times. I think they're called cowrie shells. And when the Europeans came, they obviously realized these shells were being used and started harvesting them and then flooding the markets with these shells, which, in addition to having their colonial powers, weapons, and so on, they basically destroyed this currency. And so once again, I'm thinking about methods to manage the exploitation of something like this. And in Kenya, if all things were equal, maybe the elders could have engraved something on the shell or used a really rare version of it, or somewhere where the other people didn't know they could be harvested. And in my example here, you could have a closed loop where people just mine fake value. Let's say 10 people just sit together and just grind through. And I thought, well, maybe there's some sort of trust score you could apply to that, or come up with something. And at the end of the day, the larger point is, if I was a merchant in Kenya and a ship sailed in with 1,000 of these shells and no one ever did business with them, maybe you think twice about letting that money into your economy. And again, here I am thinking about just how would you control these tokens, just like you would seashells back then. And while this is not the point of what I'm bringing up here, it's a little sidetrack, is maybe that idea about when money comes into an economy, that's a good point to consider when we're talking about tokens, but it's a bit of a side point. But with money in centralized systems like fiat, trust is institutional, crypto is basically trustless, local peer systems are deeply trusted and contextual. We can all understand that, but it's very hard to understand, as Josh mentioned, what's portable about money, that part of trust. Like there's a portability part the context doesn't hold. And I can't really think of any single example to give, but that the value of people's efforts are in what you trust might be not so simple as just stacking coins. So if you think of like a baker, they have no formal training, but they feed 500 people a week. A surgeon might save a person's life every week. A caregiver who, say, raised the surgeon for 30 years or 20 years of their life isn't really thought to have much value at all. But without that person, the surgeon wouldn't exist. So I often wonder if there are properties to trust, meaning we think of stacking tokens as ways of storing money. But I often wonder if there's some other way to define that portable component of trust. And I mean, I have a friend who is in physics, and they suggested like econophysics and statistical physics. I don't know nothing about those, but I did kind of imagine that, everyone's value is really dependent on the nature of where they are in that moment. And it's not lost on me that half of you are working on near trustless or trustless systems, and the other half are dealing with deeply trusted systems. So at its core, when we leave a local area, the deep context of trust fades. And if we could somehow figure out to transfer that gravity of trust that a person has, or define that, I'm obviously just throwing these words out, but is there something there that bridges trust to other spaces? And so again, going back to the idea of a primitive log, maybe you have your contextual data in that record, and then values that more relate to the nature of the agreement that help shape trust. And as far as I'm concerned, that's about all I have there. I just have one last thought to share, which is from an adoption standpoint, our current economic system simply doesn't value huge portions of human cooperation, which is something that clearly replicates itself through each version of money we adopt. Raising children, caring for elders, helping a neighbor, volunteering, sanitation, and you can just go on and on. These acts there's nothing for capital to chase, and they're just not very easily monetizable. And they exist outside the market, and they exist, of course. And what if that's the flaw, that we're not able to store all human capital, all effort, and maybe we've only had access to a particular size pan that was too small for the whole ham. And where I think about this is, in a world that we have today where capital is focused on capital, if an idea like this had value in some form, it could be implemented in places where capital doesn't look, and as people use it, not to gamify it again, but maybe people would recognize, wow, I am a contributor to my community. I'm a contributor to my neighbors and family, and even others. And maybe logging that would teach people that there's real money there. And maybe that real money has real value. But this is all just a thought. So that's really all I have. And I'll turn it back over to Josh.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Well, I'll turn it over to whoever else wants to respond to that, because I feel like what you spoke about relates to different aspects of what I've already spoken about in past episodes with George, Will, and Teun. So I'd like to see if any of them want to respond to any of that. Yeah, Teun, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was a quite long story,
Sorry
I
about
think.
that.
And I think it's because economy is sort of evolved in different areas differently, and has some sort of center points in the world where let's say the brunt of the economy is sort of created. What I always like to do when I hear stories like this is just to clarify things and sort of tear it apart in different segments. I think one segment that is, for me, is one of the most important, even more important than Demurrage, I think, is the creation of money. So how is money created? And each, let's say, system that is being designed has an idea of money creation. And most of the systems basically skim off, let's say, the system that are already existing. So they use the existing values that are already being created and spin something of it. And if the initial, let's say, value of money creation is not fair, then you can spin off whatever you want, but it won't be fair. So to make things clear, I like to sort of separate these things. So I think that you can only make, let's say, fair money if you look at a community and as a whole, and not try to think too much on, okay, what happens if this community is going to be connected to the other community. Just look at one community, just to make it simple. So, and then you say, okay, how is money created here? That is, I think, the most important step. So how is this this coin or token. I don't like the word token too much. It's too too sounds too crypto to me. So I just like to talk about coins and how are coins created. That is step one. Then the next problem that sort of needs to be solved is the hoarding. I think not only the hoarding of money, but also the hoarding of land, and I'm also talking about the hoarding of IP rights, is something that is sort of disrupting the fairness in society, because once, let's say, the hoarding becomes the focal point, and there are some people that are able to hoard and use that amount they hoarded to basically push out the other people out of the economy, then you have an issue. And that's where Demurrage comes in. So Demurrage is just a fantastic tool to make sure this hoarding doesn't work. And of course, when we only had gold and we didn't have computers, it was very complicated to make systems that introduce Demurrage, because it's like a percentual thing. And so this not very complicated, but there is some calculations involved. And in a society that has no calculators at all, it is quite difficult to use. But now we have digital tools. Now we can use that, and that is to prevent the hoarding. So and to me, these two aspects, so how is money created, and how do you introduce demurrage, they are very critical in the design. So without it, you will create a mess. Now, the last thing, and that is basically the topic of today, is trust. And what happened to me is basically, when I look at the current society, it's like a society of scarcity. Scarcity is created artificially because the people that are in control, they use that, they know that this scarcity will really benefit them. So it's created like this. And what we should want is, if you want to create a more fair, let's say, society, then basically you need to make an inversion to invert it. And that has happened to me when I was looking at, let's say, insight. I call it insight in transactions. If you can see all the transactions of others, then you start to build trust. If you make, let's say, a trustless society where you can't see anything, where you can't, so there's another system like what they do in crypto that take care of it, but I can't see anything, then there is basically there is no trust. But it doesn't work in small societies. At least I see that needs to be flipped. So instead of having no trust, you should have absolute trust. And absolute trust comes only, in my opinion, with absolute insight. So everybody can check everybody's, let's say, financial dealings, as if your household would do. Because if and perhaps you don't put it in a book, but in a household you remember, okay, my son did this, my son did that. Perhaps I should reward him, award him with something to do like this. It's sort of automatically, but that is because everybody sees what everybody is doing, and not because nothing is being nothing is visual. So when you create, let's say, a game or something like that, to me that would be the starting point, because if you, let's say, look at, and that is, I think, a sort of a pitfall for people that are studied economy. And I also studied economy in the beginning, but I sort of zoomed out quite fast, because I didn't understand it exactly as Josh said in his intro. When they talk, it's the let's say the theories about scarcity that doesn't make really sense, because to me, let's say, the world is quite abundant. And I think also I was thinking about Will. I'm in Rwanda, he's in Kenya, I think, let's say, when you look back 100 years or 200 years, when people were, especially travelers, when travelers went down, let's say, through African villages, when they were arrived in these villages, they probably didn't have coins, and perhaps they had shells, but how do you, uh, let's say, cut down shells in four pieces if you have a small payment to do? I think a lot of, let's say, the exchanges is done on sort of barter. Perhaps the people that came to a village had some goods with it, so they traded some goods, they did some jobs, but money is probably a very small part of the community. And in a world of scarcity, and where where you sort of imagine that everybody is struggling, so because everything is scarce, then money becomes sort of a savior. Because if I have money, then I can go to a village and say, okay, I can survive. But if I don't have money, people just don't know how to survive anymore. How do you survive, let's say, if you don't have money and you land in some village in Tanzania or wherever? So what do you do? People don't know, and that should come back. And I think the first step to do that is to create a financial system where trust is very important. And once this trust is built, then you can sort of phase out the coins itself, and get to a situation that existed probably a few hundred years ago already, or 1,000 years ago. So that is sort of my observation, if I listen to your story.
Great, thanks, Teun. Will, you got anything to say about all that?
Whew, guys, there's a lot there. I mean, I like starting with your intro, Josh. You talked about this sort of like phase transition between like the management of a household, like an actual house, versus what you call formalization of transactions. And for me, it's a lot about just answering that question of how do people deal with common resources, right? How does the child know that he can take from the family, from the kitchen? Are there limits on that? Is there a point at which he's expected to give back? Maybe he becomes a teenager or an adult. What does that look like? And, if you were to enter a village without money, you'd find out quite quickly what people do in that case. And usually you offer some sort of support. And in the village I live in here, like if you go to someone's house when they are asking for help, then you have some sort of like credit in that community, right? And the person who you helped has some sort of indebtedness to help you in return. And so like the base kind of protocol there is essentially curation of what people think is valuable to themselves and community, and relative valuation of those things. And that can be done with national currency or many, many different ways. And then there's kind of limits on how much you can pull from that commons, right? How much can I ask my neighbors without giving back in return? And if you've got those three things, you've got curation, valuation, and limitation. You need some sort of exchange rituals around that. It can be turn-based, market-based. And if you look at a credit union or a tabletop banking group, you put in money, let's say, and the amount of money you put in gives you an amount you can borrow, right, from the pool. And you set up some basic rules, the same idea. In that case, they're curating what they deem as valuable as just money in a typical national currency lending group. And they would say, okay, well, everyone's money has a one-to-one value to each other. There's limits on how much of people can borrow from that pool. And we're going to set up, a schedule in terms of how people can actually take out those loans. And basically what happened was we kind of went into a single type of an asset. So when we say money, we're talking about a term that we get from the Romans. It's a really old tradition. And I want to basically replace that word with commitment. And we can say the Romans committed to, we're going to be nice about this. And we say the Romans committed to providing security to towns and villages if you paid them in that coin. And of course, they minted the coin, right? So you'd have to go, and they minted it in the temple of Juno, Moneta, and that's where we get the word money. And she was the goddess of, it was just Hera, she was the goddess of security, protection of wealth and whatnot. And so you would go to her and say, you would say, I need to get this money so I can pay for security. And they would say, okay, fine, you're going to work for us now, right? And that basic method is almost exactly transplanted into all the colonies, right? So like the British came here and said, okay, we're going to free you from the Arabs, from chattel slavery, and we're going to tax you every single hut here, and we're going to provide protection for those who pay their tax. And the only way you can pay the tax is by working for us. And if you don't work for us, we're going to beat you and pull you into camps so that you will work for us, right? And so that was it was weaponized harm prevention in a sense, but there was a commitment there. And we might not like that commitment, but if we say, okay, well, what are the other types of commitments that people could offer? And we look at all kinds of instruments we have today, right? We have airline miles, we've got phone credit, we've got IOUs of all kinds, we've got gift cards, vouchers. You have tons and tons of these types of instruments that are essentially promises, right? And the promise of the state has kind of taken over that role. And so I spent the last, 15 or so years creating hundreds and hundreds of different community groups and different businesses creating little commitments. And what I had to translate in my mind for the last, 6 years was to get out of the monetary box, right? If everything is under monetary theory, you're in a very small realm that ought to be much, much larger. When we think about resource coordination, we're talking about the coordination of all kinds of resources. Money is one type of a commitment of the state. Beautiful. We can all make commitments. Like we can all have buttholes. Wonderful. What do we do with all those buttholes? Well, hopefully we've got some system that enables us not to just shit on each other, right? That we can actually like deal with all of that shit. So the idea of taking these basic protocols for resource coordination and turning that into something that's kind of a functional mechanism of commoning, right? Like I'm really into verbs rather than nouns. So what are you doing in these places? We say the word mutual credit or we say the word currency, like what's the action that's actually happening? Are you pooling resources in some way? Are you pooling commitments? What does that look like? So the term commitment pooling kind of came out of that as a way to describe these really ancient practices that are everywhere in every culture in the world. And they're also in boardrooms, they're also in platoons in armies. They cooperate quite well. They can put their commitments together. They can draw upon them when they need them in a fair way, right? Cooperation is not terribly complicated. You just end up with a lot of silos. So this platoon is trying to kill this platoon. They're really good at cooperating individually, but then they try to kill each other. So what's the protocol of connecting those systems together? And again, it goes back to commitment pooling again. Like, is there a way to connect across those groups? And so bridging across networks and creating federations of trust networks is about having common resources between pools, and you create bridges across all that stuff. So just making that translation and just saying, okay, let money just be the thing that the Romans kind of indoctrinated the world with. That, if you go into a village and ask someone what money is, they know. It came here with the British. It has a name. It's a tradition. It's like, like if you went to someone and said Christmas isn't Christmas, you can invent your own Christmas now. It's just like, come on, guys. Everyone knows what money is. It's the state's thing that they charge taxes in, right? It's their commitment for some kind of security, and it's a pretty crappy social contract, right? We can all agree that it's super unstable. It's really lame, and the reason we're probably having this podcast is because we all feel like the state's commitments are mostly a pile of crap, right? They've really done a bad job in a lot of cases in terms of actually being aware of like what is the value of that thing? What's the commitment behind it? So anyways, that's my translation of this of the state of being in the community currency world. And yes, we do. Demurrage is just a form of expiration rate on a commitment, right? Really simple stuff. You can have you have all kinds of ways that your commitment can lose value over time. You can also have spatial demurrage or cost from jumping between different pools. Right, you can have all kinds of like network space demurrage where there's a cost for going across different spaces. So there's a whole world there that's ready as like a science to go into resource coordination if we can get out of our stagnation into just currency and money. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. George, we haven't heard from you. Your specialty in this big picture is more in the technical side of how do you implement these ideas in formal technology. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to contribute in response to anything that has been said so far?
Yeah, first of all, hopefully my mic's all right. My receiver kind of died and then I had to recharge it. All good. Yeah, so I was kind of first heard about this kind of commitment pooling idea and kind of this trust kind of area from Will in that podcast you did not that long ago. And so thank you for Will for doing that. It was a breath of fresh air. I love the ideas around this. And I think there's so much upside opportunity to kind of think about how we not just exchange, but just also how we kind of build relationships. It's very multifactorial, the impacts this could have. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of opportunity based on this kind of the kind of overview of what we're trying to talk about here in this extending trust with digital systems. The trust between like a family dynamic is kind of very natural. And it's very kind of like relationship reputation based. So I could trust my family, my brother, my dad, my mum, all these different, my family with a lot of different things, whether it's money, time, future commitment. It's a very inherent kind of thing. And that kind of, it starts to extend to very close friends, but kind of starts to reduce over the further out I get from that kind of field. Now, the big thing is if I did something wrong with my family, that I'd have to live with that for an extended period of time. If I stole something off my father, my brother, or any family member, then the ramifications of that for the relationship would not be something I could easily escape unless my choice was to abandon my family. So the cost of breaking that trust is extremely high. But as you kind of move away from your kind of close circle, and I know there's like a stat or a paper that goes like there's around about 150 people realistically that you can kind of keep relationships with. So there is kind of like a pragmatic limit on how many people you're going to trust at kind of different degrees. I think it's a good kind of response to Teun's kind of idea around the kind of level of trust is I don't think you need to get to kind of like full trust level. It's kind of like there is a range of trust. And the objective of any of these digital systems is how can we reliably kind of increase the trust level for the different people you're interacting with. Like, I don't think I really need a digital system for my family dynamics, for instance. It's like there could be some value in that, but there's already enough of a deterrent and the importance of my relationship with them to not break that trust for me. But one of the interesting areas around this, I think, is visibility. So I feel like with some of the communities that Will's working with, where there's the kind of cooperation between different people, those kind of contributions and commitments are more visible to the other people because those communities are a bit more collaborative and kind of communicate more. They're a bit more close together. Whereas I think you see in a lot of Western society, partly due to the economics and how things have been structured, is that people are a bit more isolated. So the visibility, if I do something nice for my neighbor, the visibility of that kind of contribution and commitment to helping out the local community might not be as easily seen. And I feel that is an opportunity with some of these systems, is how can we kind of make it easier to make that visible in a way, which kind of brings more value to the contribution of how I'm interacting and kind of doing things to foster a relationship with different community members. But that value does come at a cost, because now if there's like value in me in having these connections with different people where it's clear that I've made some kind of contribution and I'm trying to build relationships in the community, that could also be an attack vector where it's kind of like I can enter a community, try to forge these different things, and then I know I can easily kind of extract $50, $100 through these other commitments that other people offer to me. So it's much easier to verify things when it's like my family. But as you start to move away from the stack, and it's easier for me to eject from that kind of community or kind of establishment, you have more issues of trying maintaining the trust, because the deterrent from things like reputation are more difficult and less meaningful to me. It's like, yeah, I've only just met you, I've only spent an hour or 2 hours with you, and I've only met you in a certain setting 5 or 10 times. That only has a certain level of value to me on a relationship level for me to be like, how much do I know you're not going to do X, Y, Z? And I would be cautious on how much I'm willing to commit, whether it's, I'm lending you X money or I'm giving you 10 hours of my time. It's all of those things would be more in question. So I feel one of the things that we can do with digital systems is start to think about how can we add to that system to extend it? So some of the ideas is like, for instance, I've been looking at Demurrage and network coins and tokens and that as a new form of money. Well, these new forms of money could be really good examples for things that could be things like contract collateral. Now, contract collateral could be like, I'm locking up this amount of collateral for a year or 2 years, so then that I abide by the agreements of when I exchange goods with someone and do some normal activity. But also it could be relevant for the trust-based things. So I'm not saying that there needs to be money that is exchanging hands, just something else of value that creates some form of deterrent for me not to act in a way that's, against the kind of community that I'm within. So it could be like I have, $100 worth of collateral that's kind of like attached to these commitments of what I'm offering. And it just kind of adds more guarantee of like, well, if something goes wrong and we have a mediation service, if someone lies or tries to cheat the system, then that collateral is locked up and it could go through some arbitration service to be like, well, this person's actually trying to harm the community in some way. And that collateral is like a safeguard. So in those kind of situations, I wouldn't necessarily need to be a family member with that person or like a super best friend. I could be like, you've interacted with an indirect friend here, or these are the interactions I know about and the things that I have certain levels of trust over. And these other forms of things, whether it's like exchange history and transactions, and is my identity attached to it? Is like my government issued passport or identity, is that attached to the kind of person I'm interacting with in this digital system? All of these different things are forms that can help to extend and push that trust of the things I'm willing to kind of interact with you, maybe on a free basis. It's the same as interacting on an economical basis using money, but it's also relevant for trust things. So it can help to both of those levels. Like the trust-based one might be a bit less because there's, but the economic one could be a bit higher. And you're just trying to move both of them further along on this kind of trust basis by using different techniques, different things of value that help to create a deterrent for bad behavior. So if I had like a Twitter equivalent profile that had a lot of activity, a lot of followers, and a lot of things, there's a value to that. It takes time to build up that kind of follower base. That is something that if that's attached to my identity and I can't escape that, I'm more inclined to not ruin that, because it's like, well, then why would I do that for $10? Because it might be worth $1,000 a year. So all of these little things contribute towards I can start to trust someone and start to interact with them without any economic exchange, because I can see they've put this effort into their identity, their reputation, some collateral, whatever it is, to start building trust in a different way. And I love the commitment pool things, because when you take away the money thing, it's a very different arrangement and cooperation. It's like I'm trying to interact with you in a different way. This isn't just end transaction money. It's just kind of like I'd like to kind of foster more of a relationship. And I think there's so much opportunity with that in things, in these kind of local settings, like whether it's an apartment block or a new kind of co-living space that pops up, like these environments where you don't know anyone and you want to jump in and kind of like start to really join that community quickly. These background things could really accelerate that process, instead of me having to start from scratch and have to be like, do a contribution, and slowly kind of build up that trust. I could have like trust that kind of is very portable. So I can join and leave communities. And it's just like, well, there's lots of things, there's reasons here for you to be like, this is clearly a good actor. And that's I think that's where the digital systems really could be really beneficial. Is that kind of like being able to move around and not have to like do all of the kind of local relationship stuff. before you can really kind of engage with that community. It could speed up that kind of relationship, kind of the more you're willing to kind of trust that person for different things. And I think that's quite exciting. I think that'd be a good point to pause. But yeah, I'm very excited with this space and how synergistic and complementary these kind of two areas are.
One recurring theme that has come up in a bunch of past episodes, and that I still struggle to really get into my head, is the question of whether the systems that we are trying to imagine up individually or as a group are thought to be complementary to the dominant system or potentially to replace the dominant system. And for example, we had Michael Linton as a guest. He's in the audience today. He's the creator of the Let's model. And the Let's model is a wonderful, organic, beautiful thing, but it typically has some constraints in terms of how broadly it can expand. And so in my conversation with Michael, the question came up, how could you ever accomplish, for example, manufacturing an automobile in an economy that is based on the dynamics of Let's? If these ideas are intended to be more than complementary, to be potential replacements for a system that I think we all agree is prone to catastrophic failure and may need to be replaced whether we like it or not, the question becomes, do any or all of these models have the scalability that would be necessary to replace building of a freighter ship, that we depend on to survive, that we depend on to get food from wherever it's grown to where we consume it. So does anybody want to chime in on that, on the issue of scalability, complementarity, or really shifting from one paradigm to another? Mike?
Thanks.
Go ahead.
And just to point out, I appreciate you guys being patient with me. That was a pretty broad thing that I was discussing, but I really think all of you touched on something. But Will, you said something about monetary theory that strikes me, because as a person who came into this conversation not having, like I said, worked on developing something, I understand as a fact that our existing system, if I was an engineer and I said I produced a monetary system that produces wealth for 5% of all of humanity, 50% will live in abject poverty and be extracted, another 40% will just barely scrape by, and then there'll be about 5% that'll do well enough to be happy and uphold the system. If you were an engineer and you were designing anything, nobody would hire you. You'd be horrible at that. So we have a system that supports building rockets, doing all of these amazing things, but it's inefficient. And so you sort of sit there, as we do, you mentioned the Romans kind of put this system into the world and everyone just kind of accepts it. And so I agree with all of that. But it is a highly inefficient system. And George's point about how do you stretch trust past silos, because it sounds, when I read your book, Will, I realized that you're really talking about very well organized groups that share and commitments and resources and have deep understanding. How do we stretch that out? And obviously, thinking about our regular system, how do you use that to fund a rocket ship? But in my mind, I think about my mind's to the 90% of humanity when I'm thinking about this subject. The larger enterprise piece feels like less important to me, and I just wanted to share that. But I think your point about efficiency and the kind of way we that is the world we just are hooked onto. Imagine if you, George, came up with a solution that allowed two of Will's silos to trust each other more efficiently. How could that expand opportunities and that kind of unlimited capacity of human cooperation? And that's just what I wanted to say there. I don't obviously have an answer, but I thought your points on those were really important.
Yeah, perhaps
Yeah.
I can also say something. Oh, sorry, Will. I think if you look at the system today, and it looks like it's very badly designed. Well, I think it's very well designed, because it does exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's extract wealth for the people that control the system. So it works perfectly. Yeah, so the people that created it are quite smart. It's not a coincidence that it looks like this and that it works like this. The issue that is, and there are basically in my mind, there are two approaches to solve this. And I'm an engineer, so I look at it as an engineer more than an economist, I think. So there are two approaches to sort of change the system, and one is, let's say, I call it a slow change. So you start to add let's say little humps on it that can grow by itself, and then sort of be an example for other people, and then more people will join that little hump, and then it can grow out, and perhaps it can let's say overtake the existing system like a sort of a cancer. But how and when I started to, let's say, to think about, let's say, changing the system, I also thought, and basically up to a half a year ago, I also thought, okay, you need to build a good system that is different and that is attractive, and the flaws that are there are not there, so that people can recognize, and then it slowly can grow to overtake the current system. But at the moment, I don't think that is realistic. So, for example, cryptocurrencies, that is I'm looking at it for about 7 years now, and I can see it's not overtaking the system at all. Actually, the system is overtaking the cryptocurrencies now, and sort of integrating it to make the system how it was created even more efficient. So it will not benefit the common people that for example live in a market, or that trade on the market in Nigeria or something like that. For me it's like unthinkable that crypto will do anything positive for those markets over there. So what I think is a better approach and I like, let's say, for example, the work that Will did. What I think that you should do is say, okay, how if we don't need to look at what is existing here, how would we organize something if we could build it from scratch? How does it look like? What should we do? And also, when we start with a new system, do we already, because we don't have that trust yet. So even if we start from scratch, let's say in a year, then you still need to build trust in that system. So so where do you start with a new system, and how do you evolve, let this system evolve to something where you have more trust and where you don't need, let's say, coins to do transactions, and can do let's say transactions in a in more like a familiar way, like it's done in a family. That would be for me, and that's also how I look at things now, and to don't be bothered with the system that we have now, because there are so many pitfalls that you can imagine that can sort of shut down any, let's say, initiative that starts to accelerate and starts to become a threat to the existing system. There's so many things that, let's say, the existing system can do to shut that down, and you can see that already happening with cryptocurrencies, if you think that that would be a solution. So that to me, it's better just to focus on what is it now that we really want, and what things do we really don't want ever at all. And one of the major things I think is the money creation. It's, to me, it's insane that we allow a tiny group of people to create money out of nothing, and basically extract all the wealth with that privilege. Because that is, to me, the number one issue of money at this moment. And I don't think you can sort of gradually phase that out. I think you need to imagine something better, and then let large groups of people understand this, what we have is really not good. This is how it should look like, and then create a movement to see, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to swap directly to it, or can we imagine a few big steps to get to a system like that? And that makes more sense to me. So first look at what you really want, and then sort of look back where we now, and then imagine the steps to that system. If we don't do that, it's sort of, okay, we try something small and hope it will work, and then hope it will scale, and hope we have no vision of how that would look then when it scales. I think that is not the right approach to have. So,
Will, you had something to say?
Yeah, but just back to sort of like, are we talking about functional mechanisms for resource coordination? And like, what George was talking about is like, what are the barriers for those, right? Do we need more insurance? Do we need collateral? Do we need time-locked staking? What are the mechanisms that sort of help people to cross silos? And if we look at like a corporation, or like just a typical business contract where I say I'm going to deliver some tomatoes to Michael, well, that's a small pool, okay? That's a pool in which both of us have put in a commitment. One has been for labor or for tomato delivery, and the other is for money, okay? So we have two resources, commitments for resources in that pool. There's limits on how much resources we're going to put in before we get reciprocity, right? So we can define very normal business contracts as forms of cooperation. If we really try to actually create science out of this and say, okay, well, what are some basis sets of protocols and functions necessary for basic resource coordination that are the same in a corporation as they are in this village, as they are in a family? What would those be? I think that's a really fun question, and I think we should keep asking it and stop trying to polarize and say, no, it's totally different here and here. Well, why is it different? Is that a phase transition? Why? What makes that different, right? Are we talking in a family? We're talking more about like certifications, unlocking pooled resources. Like, you are my child, Michael. You get access to this stuff. Okay, well, that's still a pool. In that pool, now we have certifications going in rather than commitments or vouchers for resources, right? You can have all kinds of digital representations or manifestations of intention and promises and commitment that are being pooled all the time. So if we can convert into that language, then what we get is this efficiency that we're talking about right here. So if we say, okay, look, Michael, I owe you some fucking tomatoes, and you're going to give me some money when I deliver the tomatoes, okay? But I haven't delivered the tomatoes yet, right? What do we do? So I owe you some tomatoes, right? You're holding my commitment to deliver tomatoes. And it turns out that if we can articulate that structure into an entire network of transparent offers, we can do what's called multilateral clearing. So if George happens to need something from me, right, he could buy that service off of you, for instance, right? So you could buy the debt that I owe you onto him. So my tomatoes could go to him, or something else that I can offer can come to him. So this happens all the time in business networks. There's all kinds of credit clearing going on. And it used to go on everywhere, right? This was the norm. Like humans did not evolve through direct swap barter ever, right? Their original economic systems were common pooled resources, and those allowed all these efficiencies to happen. We weren't in little silos or, a whole network of Uniswap pairs. We were in all kinds of pools of resources that you could draw from, and that was what was connecting us across these things. So what's happening is we're seeing cooperation happening at government levels. We see cooperation happening in military and all these things, and we say, okay, well, why are they in such silos? Why and what happened to the cooperation of just normal people, right? And if we really look into what's happening, and you made this comment of like someone made the comment, I forget who it was, but that how is it that only a few people can issue these currencies? It was you, Tuan. Well, really, the question is, well, why can't we all be issuing commitments? Why can't we all make promises to each other, right? Well, of course we could, right? So what's the system that actually enables all of those promises, could be buttholes, could be whatever, to actually interact with each other? Like what's the form of that? What's the protocol that enables that to happen? Right. And if we can identify that, then we can say, oh, okay, we can actually create bridges across all of these things. And what's the limitation? Why aren't we making those bridges already? Maybe we need more collateral. Maybe we need people to come in and actually provide that risk to create those hops between those networks. Right. And so the networking space that we see being created by just articulating resource coordination protocols, right, is really huge, because now we're speaking about a language. And that language becomes valuable as people use it more, right? And so if there is a language for resource coordination, we should learn it, right? And I think our ancestors spoke it. And I think that a lot of, if you upper echelon credit markets and, corporate finance, they speak it also. There is actually, and we're missing that translation, right? So how do we do it? How do we actually coordinate resources? And I think that's a really rich, fun discussion. And I think, like there's all kinds of stuff we can do. And blockchain is fucking amazing. Jesus, Tuan. Oh my gosh. You can do so much with it. It's amazing. I mean, just today, I was setting up a multi-signature wallet between 3 people who had never had a bank account before. All of a sudden, they can pool their resources. They can choose quorum on how many people to sign to move those assets around. They can do so much. And not only that, they can create resource pools where they can decide on the rules. OMG, it's amazing. I can't believe it's so amazing. Honestly, guys, like, stop it. Stop shaming it. Just try it. I'll happy to go through it with you. I'm really tired of that conversation. It's so boring. It's so fucking old. So thank you, guys.
Yeah, I have to agree on the opportunities with Web3 are through the roof.
No, don't understand me wrong. So I have nothing against blockchain technology. I think it's amazing. I know how to program it. I know how to hash, to code hashes. I know all these things, and it's amazing. So that is not my my system that I created also has like I call it personal blockchain technology in it. So that is not it's not the technology that I'm talking about. The problem that I see is that and I call it mixing of ethical and unethical money. I think the money that is used now, let's say the euros and the dollars, is unethical because we allow a tiny group of people to create it out of thin air, and they have a big, let's say, advantage over anybody, and with that advantage, they can basically do whatever they want, and they did it with the cryptocurrencies. And so you need to have, let's say, fiat money to buy yourself into Bitcoin or into another. Okay, you can also mine, but then you need to buy big mining rigs. So people that don't have the capacity to do that, they will always be, let's say, standing back, and they will even, let's say, the difference will be even be bigger. So we don't solve that, let's say, that wealth in inequality that is currently in society by just adopting that technology. So we need to adopt it in a smart way. That's the only thing that I'm saying.
Mike?
If I could hop in. So I think, to your point, it's what strikes me is, and Will is bringing this up, it's like I'm thinking about it in terms of an individual. So you have a commitment pool. Not every commitment pool works out. Not every action is reciprocated. So it's like, imagine your own life and you make agreements with people, and some are successful and some are not. It's like kind of record of your own life attaching to various commitment pools, for example. And I apologize for not having the best vocabulary on this, but the idea being is that I see it kind of through the lens of like blockchain, in that if you had a way, you're interacting the world within your own space. Maybe you're part of many different pools and resources. If you had a way of capturing that, there would be a level of commitments you follow through on, and there'd be a level of commitments you don't follow through on. And I would assume if you know people that are in three separate commitment pools, but you know all three, and one person wanted to join a different one, and somebody came to you and said, is this person worth joining? Your word would be like a value that would say this person's allowed to come in and potentially, even though it might be a risk, we're going to take that risk. And maybe that ends up being a risk, you know? And I just wonder if there's a way to kind of capture that kind of very individual behavior, in the sense to see what the patterns are. Because I would imagine there's a lot of commonality in these very basic behaviors. Like if you stripped out what the resources were for, there would be underlying very consistent properties to it. And it's just something that sticks with me. And I only want to add one thing, Teun, which is I agree with everything you said about like how we think about adopting these systems. Imagine this idea only available to people in homeless encampments. Like just imagine a group of people, the world's discarded them, but they cooperate and they start improving each other's lives. Like just imagine some really meaningless space where you're not trying to replace anything. The goal isn't to replace the world as it is what it is. But imagine if you had a technology which even gave a group of people who have no value in the current system that ability to cooperate and translate it even past that little group. And those are the two thoughts that I had when I hear you speaking. It's like if we go up against this system will get co-opted by like the evil empire. You can see it happening with the crypto, the money side of crypto, but the blockchain side seems so exciting. But when I go down to Will's perspective, I realize it's like we're all human beings. We're always cooperating and figuring out, but there's also a lot of failure points, but we're human. So why aren't we kind of keeping track of that? Maybe an average person is successful cooperating 70% of the time. And if we understood that, maybe that would be a useful thing. But I'm going to think it through blockchain or some technology that allows you to, that less definable context, that once you step away from your group, is there a way to measure that so that you could transport that? And not, I don't want to think about money at all with that. It's more just remembering good things everyone is doing in that space.
Yeah, I guess I'll go from here.
Yeah.
The thing I'm interested, yeah. So the part of the question was like, could we replace money with these kind of trust-based systems? And at current, I'm open to the idea of how extended this kind of trust network could go, but I'm not yet convinced of it replacing the need for money. I feel these are synergistic kind of things. As an example, for the reputation kind of based trust, In my family, I might be doing lots of commitments and contributions and expecting absolutely nothing in return. It is completely one directional. It could go on for the whole of our lives, where, for instance, I might have more resources or time or whatever, and I'm just willing to keep giving because I care about the relationship. The more you move away from, and I think there's a limit, and I think it's a fair comment to say there's a limit in how many quality relationships you can have. So on that basis, we can say, well, there's a limit to the relationship-based kind of trust dynamics that are going to be reasonable at scale. And that could be 150. We might do extend it where you really trust a lot of people, but there's got to be kind of some reasonable limit there on the relationship side, because there's only so many reasonable relationships I can have with someone. As you start to move away from the relationship, how I act and what I expect in terms of like reciprocity does change. For instance, like I might give away, like if I was driving someone a 10-minute lift, I'd be pretty open with helping a broad range of people on that, maybe anyone. But then they say, oh, could you take me 2 hours from Bristol to London? That's a much bigger commitment, and you're asking a lot more of my time. So in that instance where maybe you're not my family, you're not a close friend, and that is like, well, what would I get? This kind of commitment, maybe I'm saying I'm offering kind of time to this community. That what do I get back from that? And this kind of comes back to, I don't care about the visibility of my contributions in my family. I might want it to be a private matter, and that just be my family, and it doesn't need to be digital. It could be. I'm not saying it doesn't have to be, but I care less about that, because it's the relationship's the important thing. When it moves away from the relationship, I might not, without a digital solution, I might not give this person a 2-hour lift from there, because I like, unless they have something they could return that's beneficial for me, or I don't care enough about the relationship. There's limitations in how much time I can give away, because my time is limited as well. But if, for instance, let's say that contribution is a commitment, and everyone can see that I'm going to offer this person 2 hours lift for there, because I can do it. What is there other things that I can kind of benefit from, that you can kind of verify the authenticity of that? It's the visibility of the things I'm going to do to others that might either benefit me in some way, because it's not relationship based, or it might actually benefit me in let's say it's in an apartment block, and I'm giving some person in the apartment block a lift, and it's showing some kind of contribution to the well-being of this larger community. And I'm trying to kind of make some more visibility that I'm here to kind of help people around that. And if there's visibility on that, then it's not just the one-dimensional thing on the relationship. I don't necessarily need to be fostering a relationship in this situation. It could be beneficial in a multitude of ways. One, it's good for the relationship anyway, but two, it also could be like giving people more trust in how I'm interacting with other people. And this is where these kind of digital systems could really extend what's possible here. It's not just based on raw kind of like relationship. It can kind of start to blend with other kind of ways. I could start to share, like I have some time and I have a car as a commitment to this pool. Other people might have other things and skills. And I feel that there's the relationship side of it, and that is important to a certain extent, but you have limits. Like there's only so many people you want to be friends with and spend X amount of time with. So if you can extend that with these other factors, it means that you can kind of like, I know I'm going to contribute here, and I get something else back. And it could be money, it could be other things. But then is a bigger expectation of this kind of return. When you move further along the thing, if I'm buying a car from Germany or some fancy knives from Japan, I don't really care about the relationship with the people I'm buying that from. I've got to be honest. It's like, I'm not spending any time with you. I'm not going to fly there to go and meet you. So it's like, it really is more of an exchange side. And this is where the money thing comes in. But all of these other things, and even the trust-based things, if they're public and they're verifiable in some way, and they're attached to my identity, then that could be influencing factors on what, if I can see this person is a huge contributor to just like public goods or some community kind of thing, I might actually offer you a discount for these kind of car I'm buying from you, or this or that, because I actually have some confidence in the information I'm seeing. It's like, these kind of people are good for society. And generally, maybe this company is like, well, we're trying to promote and be like, we're really positive on these actions. And if you can verify those actions, then you could actually alter the economic exchange here, that what might not have been a relationship-based connection, but it might have been like an action, and how you contribute to society, kind of change in exchange. So I think there's so much opportunity in it, like trying to align different incentives and also kind of activity here, that it's just it's hard to comprehend how people could respond. But the accuracy and the verifiability of some of these contributions is going to be a big part of, like, when you move away from relationships, it's much easier to be like, this person's lying about that. Like, I can see that. And then I can be like, within that community, you lose your reputation. But when you move away from that, you need to have much more like confidence in these things actually happened, and is that identity real? Is that thing? But if you can increase that collateral, the reputation, all these different areas, you have some interesting things that could happen here. And I think that is why I'm not confident on how far it can go and what things people start to change the economic kind of exchange using money, and also how far the trust-based kind of connections change. Can that extend, across countries and stuff? Maybe it can. I'm not too sure. But I do think that I am not convinced yet that money will be replaced by trust-based systems. There will just be lots of synergy and improvements to both sides of the equation due to the adoption of tech that improves both.
Yeah, perhaps can I? So the discussion was, if you build, let's say, small systems that can grow and take over the, let's say, the bad system, let's call it like that, or that you need to, let's say, imagine a better system altogether, and then first you define that and then see how you're gonna get there. That is sort of the discussion I think that we had. What you, George, just described to me is economics, like all these pools. If you do it in contracts, or if you do it based on trust, that there's a lot of, especially now with blockchain technology, there's a lot of possibilities how you're going to deal with that. That is not my point. So I think if you imagine a new system, it should be full of that, so partly on things that are done with trust, and part of things that you do in contracts and smart contracts and whatever you can imagine. It's fine. The only thing that I say is that we have a system now, and if we are basing, if we base our, let's say, ideas on the system that is there, like Bitcoin, because you can only buy Bitcoin if you have fiat currencies, or you buy a big rig. So because of that, let's say Bitcoin is mixed with a bad system and is sort of tainted because of that. That's the only point that I say. So if you invent or imagine a new system, don't make it depend on, let's say, the false system, because once you start mixing it, the problem, the main problem that we have will be there, will stay. So I think you need another strategy to get to the point where you want to go. That is only my point.
Yeah, I'd like to quick jump in there. I fully agree. I think we don't have these demurrage-based systems yet. When I'm speaking about some of these ideas, myself at least, I'm imagining there is a demurrage-based Web3 system. We don't have that at present, but that is the future. I'm looking at what is a demurrage-based money system with Web3, and how is that interacting with these kind of trust-based systems that will, and commitment pools on all of these ideas. And I think that is the future kind of concept I'm looking at, rather than thinking about how it attaches to the existing parts of the industry. The topic of how we kind of encourage existing ecosystems to adopt Demurrage is a long-winded conversation that's very separate. But assuming we can get to that point, then it's like, how does that play? You've fixed the kind of system of money, and how does it kind of attach to these massive like opportunity of trustless systems, identity, reputation, and all of that. So that's kind of how I'm imagining at the moment. I've not seen any ecosystem or layer one that you'd build on top of that is showing signs of adopting Demurrage in the short term, and that is something that hopefully I'm doing everything I can, at least from my side, to contribute towards that eventually changing. But that will take time.
Yeah, I think I'm also a bit biased on that topic, because let's say the system that I built has demurrage, but the demurrage is sort of let's say connected together with the money creation. So you create money, let's say, on one side, and you have demurrage on the other side to equal it out and make sure you don't have inflation or deflation. And so these two things are very well connected. And the problem is that if you don't, let's say, solve them both together, if you leave the money creation, let's say, you leave it as it is, and you try to build something with demurrage on top of this bad system, to me, it's a very bad choice. So that's why I would like to cut these two. Just look at a system, how you create money, how you use demurrage as two let's say systems that work very close together. And then on top of that, you can build all these systems that you just mentioned.
Will, did you have something you were waiting to say?
Yeah, maybe just as a getting close to the end here. Just there's a lot to learn from credit unions and general bank lending, right? So when there's a common pool of resources that you can borrow from, like there's a lot written about that. It's, the most common forms of collective pooling are around collectively stored money, national currency. Those are all derived from earlier forms of resource pooling around all kinds of commitments, not just money. I just wanted to note that I put some links in the chat just to learn about credit unions, village savings and loan associations, corporate credit unions. There's all, invoice factoring. I'll put another one on multilateral offsetting there. There's just a lot there. And if we just think about borrowing, when you borrow something from an individual or from a collective, what are the rules on that borrowing and what goes in the first place? So if George is putting in offering liquidity of some type that's allowed by that pool in gift cards or money or Bitcoin or whatever people want to value, how much does he get to borrow? What are the rules on that collateral? Is there insurances? Are there fees taken? Those are all just really just wonderful questions to go through, and really basic stuff that's so impactful. It's amazing. If you're a child or you're a person who grows up in a community, or you're a wealthy or middle class American and you have access to borrowing, it's huge. It changes your life. And if that's borrowing from a community, right? Or if that's a community that just certifies you and trusts you, right? You get access to a common pool for whatever reason. Amazing. It literally, like the term Ubuntu comes from the term Ubuntu. It's a Bantu language group term, comes from that's from Zulu, but it goes all the way up into Kenya. And it means to become a person, Ubuntu, to become a person. And the way you do that is by getting into relationship with other people. Otherwise, you're just a human. You're of the species, but you're not of a people, right? You're not of the, and the name for these groups of people, like the group nouns for a group of human, would be these mutual aid groups that have credit and debt with each other. They borrow from each other. They're definitely in many forms of reputation credit going on, and they extend across clan networks. Is a super ancient thing, and it's essentially, are we able to actually care for and borrow from each other and share resources fairly, right? So we can simplify a lot of stuff down when we get down to just really simple language around this stuff. And I don't think we need to invent new currencies. And we've issued hundreds and hundreds of Demurrage community currencies over the years. They're great. We usually have a fairly arbitrary 2% Demurrage on them. That's really an expiry date, and it goes back into a community fund and it's reissued by the community. There's a million ways you can do that. The point is, again, not to just make more currencies. The point is, yes, make a million kinds of commitments and IOUs all you want. How do you actually pool those together and allow people to borrow from them, right? Over.
Yeah, that's sort of where where I continue to struggle and have struggled all along, is what what I saw that made me want to create this platform, this forum for conversation, is that there are the Will Ruddicks of the world, there's the Teun van Sambeeks of the world, and they are very smart, well-intentioned people coming up with brilliant ideas that I could never think of. And that's awesome. But what is the mechanism whereby they start connecting up? if Will, if you're developing your paradigm, your network, and Teun, you've got Copiania and OneCoinH, and George, you're helping other people build different networks. What is the process by which those things start to become knitted together into a paradigm that could become a global alternative to the system that we all agree needs to be replaced and might catastrophically fail at any moment?
Yeah. So I can already see how I would do this, but I strongly believe that there is a need of a different type of money. So, and I call it ethical money instead of unethical money. And that is sort of a base layer. And I didn't go even into how you call it, pooling yet, because for me the first step that needs to be taken is how do you create, let's say, a fair type of money. Once you have that, then you can build, let's say, your pooling systems on top of that, and all your smart contracts and everything that you can imagine on top of that, and where you introduce trust and where you introduce trustless things, but you need to have a proper ethical basis, because if you don't, the benefits will just be destroyed by this tiny group that has way other ideas on how this system should work. So that's sort of the hurdle I think that needs to be taken. But yeah.
I can comment on that quickly. So there's for the technology for identity, it's called self-sovereign identity. And a lot of those is you could get a credential, let's say from a university, they issue a credential to me to say I've got this kind of bachelor's degree, and all of the data in contract with that becomes this kind of decentralized kind of system for managing that credential. But I can move that credential from my wallet to any other wallet. So they don't necessarily need to be kind of hard, like a hard attachment to an existing Web3 network. You could have an identity that you're using across a few different places. So even if the existing forms of the industry are flawed in their monetary policy and the money is not going to last in perpetuity due to the concentrations of wealth and problems with storable money, you can still start experimenting and doing all these kind of trust-based things on those networks, and then migrate that identity and all of the different credentials you've received onto these new networks. So I see there being huge value in any experimentation, whether on top of existing chains or at the layer one or with the trustless things, all happening in parallel, to which then can migrate to when we see a better form of money at a base for the network coin and that base. So I think experimentation should be starting as soon as possible, and it doesn't necessarily even need to. I think as Will has been kind of experimenting, there's not necessarily always a digital system in place. You don't, but the lessons and kind of like outcomes from that are hugely valuable, whether it is using a digital system or not. But I wouldn't be shy from using even a centralized kind of system where it's just like a spreadsheet or something like that, or trying to play around with the Web3 stuff. There's probably value in all of it, but it's just a case of what's your use case and what you're trying to achieve. But yeah, definitely more experimentation, the better.
Yeah, I agree with that. Actually, the first half year I spent only on thinking about self-sovereign identities. That is really key in any financial system to me. And I could only take my next steps when I sort of figured out how a self-sovereign identity works. And the problem I see at this moment is that if you build it on the existing chains that are all built on, let's say, unethical money, as I call it, that is not a good way to start. So, but you can build it anew in a new fashion on ethical money, and I think that is quite important. But that's sort of a totally different conversation that we can have.
Yeah. I think you're just getting tripped up by the word money, honestly. I mean, you can have ethical commitments, like you honor your commitment. Was it done in good faith, right? And you could have ones where they're abjectly false, right? Like I promised something and I just didn't even intend to deliver it, right? It's super clear. We really like money being the commitment of the state, fine. If you look at all the cryptocurrencies that there are, you can say, is there a commitment behind them? Look at Bitcoin. Is there any commitment behind it? Well, you can use their ledger with it. It's not a great one. We don't maybe like the commitment as much as we could. Is there a commitment behind Ethereum? Oh, well, you can publish onto the blockchain using that. You can do transactions with it. There's various commitments to every single token there, or there aren't. And we can define that. There's a crappy commitment there. That was a commitment for a bunch of bullshit. There's a speculative trash token. There's millions of those out there. And I think it really clarifies things so much for people. And as long as we're in this jargon around money, we might as well, just put a big hashtag capitalism. What do you actually mean? What are you talking about? And if we can't actually agree on any common language or protocols, we're just, gaseous, bags of shit.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I also don't like the word money, but it's just to talk. But if we can have better definitions, please, it would be very welcome.
Maybe as just we got about 12 minutes before we hit the 2-hour mark. And this may seem kind of out of left field, but maybe a way of kind of wrapping up this session is coming back to the the theme of scarcity versus abundance. I come to this stuff out of a Wall Street background. I grew up, thinking Gordon Gekko was cool and that I wanted to be like that. And I pursued that path for a little while. And then I saw a lot that was wrong with that, a lot that I didn't want to build my life around, and went in a different direction. But the ideas of competition, the idea of self-interest, the idea of scarcity are still compelling to me. And I find that that's something that I come up against often when I have conversations with people who are trying to dream differently. Because I believe that scarcity is real. George, when you were saying, how many people can you give 2-hour rides to? The answer to that is limited, because you have a limited amount of time in the day, a limited amount of years in your life. You cannot treat your own time, your own resources as if they were limitless, because they're not. We live on a planet with finite resources. So when people make the argument that the nature of the universe is just pure abundance and scarcity is an illusion, I have a hard time relating to that, because I perceive scarcity as being real, and that it has to be, we have to take account of it in building our systems, or I think we're building, castles in the air. Any thoughts?
I'll just ping in there. When you work with a group of people, like let's say neighbors or almost any group, and you actually do a good resource mapping, you look at social resources, you look at voice, you look at skills, and all you know, everything you could possibly look at it, you end up with a huge amount of abundance, right? Like just everyone around the table is just like, wow, just in our neighborhood alone, we've got like 5 paddle boards and all these people that can do work. You have so much, right? And if you were to tick off everything that we need as humans, right, in terms of care, belonging, skills, housing, food, you know, just basics, and even higher level music, fun, creativity, we can all provide that for each other within a very small group. Like you and just your best friend can whack each other off and you feel great, right? There's all kinds of nice things we can do for each other that we just don't do, right? So we're around a lot of potential abundance. I think you can totally, and yes, of course it's limited. I'm not saying it's some infinite ideological statement here. I'm just saying like you and your neighbors can actually have fun and help each other. Like there's an abundance there, right? And it's all around us. And we've totally, I mean, siloed each other off and stopped coordinating those resources. Unless you're in a platoon of soldiers or you're in a corporate environment or you're in a group of women in a village, like the whole middle layer is just gone to like, oh, we just need money. We can't help each other at all unless we have money, right? We've just totally screwed each other over, right? And yes, you know, systematic, yada, 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 but like if you just abjectly do resource mapping, and you should with your friends, with your university, just do it more often, right? Like just we have lots of games that we play around. They're in the book as well if you check it out. It's just amazing. And I mean, many times I've been around groups around a table where people are in tears, realizing how much support we can actually give each other. Like what's the potential of that? So there's definitely potential abundance there. You know, whether or not we can realize it is the question. And it's just, you know, what's the language to get there? How do we actually like, what's the due diligence here of us being a little bit like scientists and saying, you know, how can we know any of this stuff? How do we get away from all the jargon, away from the, you know, terms like communism, socialism, capitalism, how do money, you know, how do we get into something that's much, much more real and basic and build from that? Where's the foundation? And that's, you know, like me as a physicist, that's my background. We had the standard model at least, you know, there was foundations for saying, okay, well, you know, I can plug this into this basic concept and say, well, I can somehow predict what's going to happen based on that. And I feel like in economics, the floor just dropped out. And it's just like everything's based on a whole bunch of shaky assumptions without really, you know, much going on in terms of fundamental axioms and protocols and, you know, language for it. And you end up with everyone's an armchair economist and no one can agree on anything because no one has any shared language. I mean, that's my experience so far.
Yeah, is that like it almost seems like there's our existing economic system kind of creates this artificial kind of ceiling of scarcity. It's like there's so much that is not unlocked because of our existing you know, there is always some level of scarcity, but also part of it's like it's not actually necessarily a scarcity that's not is rigid. It's like that is the level of scarcity. No, it's our economic system is really restricting and leading to these levels of scarcity, and whether it's in relationships, this or that, and different kind of aspects of human life, is this system is not contributing to maximizing our use of our resources, whether it's time, natural resources, and this. So just improving the economy is such an important part to unlocking what we do have. And it still might be scarce. We only have so much wood, so much this. It's like you can't just keep depleting it at a really rapid rate, and you only have so much time in a day. There's still like a limit on those things, but how can you unlock the maximum usage of it for the best prosperity for everyone and the planet itself, not just humankind? It's like it's the whole picture. It's like how can we try to think of what's the best thing for the entirety of the world rather than just some subset.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. So my other initiative is called Copiania, and Copia means plenty. I call it a world of plenty. To me, there's a lot in abundance. Of course, everything is finite, but for 8 billion people, we have more than enough, really more than enough. So I think the world can survive for 100 billion people, but that doesn't really matter. I think the scarcity is artificial, is done by the people that needs the scarcity to be able to control other people. So a lot of scarcity is just by design. And we need to start thinking differently. So that's why I want to talk about a world of plenty. How does that look like? It doesn't mean that we're going to consume everything, because there's no point doing that. Why would you do that? So but it's about making material, let's say a product, a car that lasts 50 years instead of 3 years. It means building houses that last way longer, that has higher quality, but also look better, make better music, make better. So everything can be done more in more abundance if we get rid of this strangling scarcity narrative and system that is sort of creeping behind that. And that is sort of what a world of plenty means. Not that we just gonna use everything and waste everything. It doesn't make any sense. It's also it won't happen. I think so.
I just wanted to say that I think Josh's perspective about scarcity. I mean, if I'm in a famine, and I can't get food, I'm experiencing scarcity, and I think the larger conversation. But I agree with everyone here that at the end of the day, like the human ingenuity can stretch resources way beyond what we, every year. Just sometimes you are kind of blown away by what can be done. But scarcity, I think, does exist in in some people's lives. That's real, especially with money today. But I think that Will's everyone here has kind of touched on it. It's like something. There's real prosperity and wealth is not the kind of idea. We're kind of, I think we're all comparing it to this larger idea, but reality, well-being is being with family, friends, health, welfare. And I think when people stare at that and they realize, well, I have a safe network, I'm going to, we don't need to like rebuild the world. It's like making those networks seem really resilient. I think alone would give people a tremendous sense of wealth in their own personal lives. And I just wonder if constantly comparing it to money, because every physical type of money ultimately is kind of, as Teun said, like it's going to get co-opted. It's going to get overtaken. But I wonder if there's a way to really capture that other part of value. Just again, just as a thought. But that's it.
There's a bit around capture that I think we just have to accept that centralization and capture is extremely normal. And most of the like enclosure of commons and our inability to share is because those commons have been enclosed. Like you need to have this regulatory environment to, do X, Y, and Z. Um, uh, and for me, like the sort of equivalent to nuclear proliferation is just say, well, if we can actually really actively make connections, right, and bypass those silos, right, we can do a lot more. So in focusing on proliferation of connections rather than siloing ourselves off or trying to say that's ethical, this is unethical, right? Like instead of creating more and more and more divisions, right? You actually say, well, how can we actively connect much more, like a rebellion of pollination rather than more silos and trying to protect ourselves, because really weaponized harm prevention, protectionism, and all that thing, it's actually the kind of the opposite of what we want in terms of resource coordination. Yes, you want to be able to say to know who you can trust and who you can bring into a resource commons, and you want to have things like identity and the ability to have trust scores within a community. But at the same time, if everything is always based on again siloing, you end up spending a lot of your effort, and you end up with the whole industries focused on harm prevention that aren't actually doing any good. And I think that's the all around the world right now we're this huge focus on harm prevention right now. And it's like, well, okay, well, who's actually doing any connection? And once you get into this mindset of we need to protect ourselves, everything's fear-based, everything's, scarcity, you're not apt to actually make connections anymore. You just end up more and more like in a prison planet, where we have to monitor and, keep people in this line. And now you got to give them a basic income so that they can go to the store, and they, like no one connects to each other anymore. And that's, that seems to be the path that a lot of the world seems to be on. And I just really wanted to get off of that path and into how do we actually go and connect with our families, our neighbors, our people around us and get out of those silos.
All right. Well, just to reflect on this first roundtable episode, I feel like it was a great success. I feel like it went as well as I could have hoped. I feel like we just did an exercise in proliferation of connections. I'm excited about the fact that Mike, George, Teun, and Will all now know each other, and I think didn't before. And this is, just the first iteration of this process. I'm excited to have come to know all of you. I didn't know anyone here other than Mike before beginning this this project, and I thank each of you for being a part of it, and I trust and hope that we will see each of you again. So thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Teun, George, Michael.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day. See you next time.
Yeah.